The Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky have long held a reputation for secrecy, a labyrinth of mist-laden hollows and steep ridges where sunlight fights to reach the forest floor and civilization feels impossibly distant. Within these ancient hills, one of the darkest chapters of American history quietly unfolded, a story of isolation, obsession, and the relentless consequences of inbreeding. Known in local legend as the Cave Demons, the Blackburn clan forged a terrifying reputation that has haunted the collective memory of Kentucky for more than a century. The story begins shortly after the Civil War, in the late 1860s, when Ezekiel Blackburn, a Confederate veteran haunted by the blood and suffering he had witnessed on the battlefields, sought to distance his family from a world in upheaval. Harlan County, with its dense forests, narrow hollows, and seemingly endless limestone caves, offered the perfect refuge. "The outside world has nothing for us now," Ezekiel reportedly told his 5 children as they ventured deep into the hills, carving out a precarious existence far removed from the reach of any government or neighbor. What began as a retreat into seclusion was initially intended as a survival strategy, a chance for a family to escape the chaos of Reconstruction and the sweeping social changes that gripped post-war America. But as decades passed, that retreat transformed into something far more disturbing. By 1887, descendants of Ezekiel's original household had begun to intermarry within the family and with the nearby Harper clan, establishing a network of bloodlines so tightly wound that their genetic inheritance became as twisted as the caves they inhabited. Historical records from the Presbyterian mission in Coal Creek provide the earliest glimpses of this unsettling reality. Missionary journals recount the spring of 1891, when unusual figures began appearing from the eastern hollows to trade for food and supplies. "They walk with an unsteady gait, their faces warp beyond what I have ever seen," Reverend Samuel McPherson wrote in meticulous detail. Some had fingers fused together into claw-like formations, others possessed eyes that refused to focus on a single point. Their speech was slow, halting, almost mechanical, as if the act of forming words was foreign to them. Visitors would sometimes see them at the edge of the woods, emerging from shadows and mist, only to vanish again as quickly as they appeared. The Reverend noted that their presence was both unnerving and deeply sorrowful, as if the land itself had shaped them into something unnatural, something caught between humanity and the darkness of the caves. By 1896, census records indicate that the Blackburn family had grown to approximately 37 individuals across 3 generations, thanks largely to intermarriage with the Harper family. The remoteness of the area and the clan's preference for isolation meant that official documentation was scarce. Many homesteads were marked as inaccessible, blank spaces on maps that reflected not just the difficulty of terrain, but the deliberate withdrawal of a community determined to remain unseen. It wasn't until 1903 that Dr. William Evans, a physician trained at Edinburgh University, accompanied tax collectors into the region, providing the first comprehensive medical observations of the clan. Evans' journals reveal a shocking portrait of a family shaped as much by geography as by its own bloodline. Malformed facial features, spinal deformities, and diminished cognitive capacity were commonplace among the younger members. Even more striking were the third-generation children, who rarely emerged from the deepest parts of the cave system. Evans described them moving with a fluid, almost animalistic precision, their senses attuned to darkness, their skin pale in the dim glow of tallow lamps. He would later note that these physical manifestations were consistent with what modern genetics would classify as consequences of generational consanguinity and isolated population subjected to repeated intermarriage over decades. The surrounding community was aware of their presence but rarely ventured near. Folk stories, whispered among miners, farmers, and itinerant travelers, spoke of strange figures glimpsed in the foggy hollows, of low guttural calls echoing from limestone chambers, and of small, pale children with wide, unfocused eyes peering from behind rock formations. By the early 20th century, these whispers had solidified into the enduring legend of the Cave Demons, a moniker that captured both fear and fascination. Yet, it was not merely the physical anomalies that defined the Blackburn clan. The family's retreat into isolation represented a conscious rejection of the modern world. Reconstruction-era America, with its rapidly industrializing cities, expanding railroads, and new social hierarchies, posed a threat to traditional ways of life. Ezekiel Blackburn and his descendants viewed themselves as guardians of an older, purer existence, separate from the corruption of outsiders. Every journey into the hollows, every choice to intermarry within the family, and every retreat into darkness reinforced a worldview that would shape generations. Even the land seemed complicit in their transformation. Limestone caves honeycombed the region, their twisting passages and hidden chambers offering both refuge and a venue for adaptation. Streams that ran underground provided fresh water, while the surrounding forests yielded game and wild edibles. In this shadowed realm, the Blackburns began a process of transformation, socially, culturally, and biologically, that would make them a subject of fascination for generations of anthropologists, geneticists, and folklorists alike. The misted hollows of eastern Kentucky, once a quiet backdrop for pioneer settlement, had become a stage for a family whose isolation, genetic choices, and adaptation to subterranean life would etch a dark legend into Appalachian history, one that continues to intrigue and horrify, even as the world above marched into the modern age. Dr. William Evans' initial observations in 1903 revealed a grim reality. The Blackburn-Harper clan had not merely withdrawn from society, they had become a living experiment in isolation and inbreeding. Traversing the dense forests and limestone ridges of Harlan County, he recorded children and adults alike whose appearances suggested something more than the toll of a harsh mountain life. Jawlines were malformed, some protruded aggressively, others seemed stunted, while spinal deformities forced hunched postures. Eyes were often unfocused, and movement sometimes resembled the cautious, jerky motions of creatures adapted to darkness. Evans noted these anomalies clinically, but they read to the outsider like the remnants of some unnatural transformation. These physical manifestations, now recognized as classic consequences of generational consanguinity, were accompanied by a disturbing cognitive toll. Many children were unable to perform basic arithmetic or recite the alphabet, despite being of school age. Language itself seemed a barrier, speech came slowly, often incomprehensibly, as though the tongue had forgotten its purpose. Yet, what was most unsettling were the third-generation descendants, who rarely ventured beyond the deepest caverns. Evans described them with a mixture of horror and awe, pale, lean figures whose sinewy limbs moved with eerie grace, their senses attuned to the perpetual dim of the limestone caves. Modern genetic analysis explains these outcomes with unnerving precision. Dr. Howard Garrison, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University, explains that repeated close relative marriages dramatically increase the risk of recessive genetic disorders. While first-cousin unions alone might raise the risk of congenital defects by 1.7 to 2.8%, multiple generations of inbreeding compound these risks exponentially. By the fourth generation, around 1910, the Blackburn-Harper lineage had reached a catastrophic peak. County medical records from the Coal Creek Clinic document children born with polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, cranial deformities consistent with microcephaly, and severe intellectual impairments. Yet geography alone could not explain the clan's transformation. Cultural isolation played an equally crucial role. The post-Civil War era in Appalachia was defined by suspicion of authority, particularly among families like the Blackburns who had fought for the Confederacy. Distrust of government and outsiders ran deep. Reconstruction policies, industrial expansion, and the encroachment of modernity created a pressure that these families met not with negotiation, but with retreat. Each generation ventured less frequently beyond the hollows, reinforcing self-sufficient microcosms. Anthropologist Dr. Margaret Wilson observes that these communities developed their own economies, hierarchies, and even dialects, functioning almost entirely independent of surrounding society. This insularity extended to language itself. Contemporary accounts describe the Blackburn-Harper clan speaking an English so altered by isolation that even neighboring Kentucky Highlanders struggled to comprehend it. Words were truncated, syntax distorted, and vocabulary reshaped by decades of disconnection. Communication within the clan relied heavily on nonverbal cues and subtle inflections, reflecting a culture adapted not just to physical isolation, but to the unique acoustics of caves, where even faint sounds echoed unnaturally. The limestone caves themselves were as much a character in this unfolding story as any human inhabitant. Geological surveys from the early 1920s documented over 40 entrances in the areas occupied by the clan. Many led to chambers capable of sheltering small groups, while others twisted into labyrinthine passages that could confound any outsider attempting to map or navigate them. These caves were not merely refuges, they were instruments of adaptation. Streams running through the subterranean channel supplied fresh water, stalactites and stalagmites created natural boundaries, and the constant darkness slowly molded bodies and senses alike. Evans' journals reveal an eerie, almost otherworldly quality to the youngest members' behavior. They exhibited traits consistent with troglomerism, reduced pigmentation, enhanced auditory and olfactory senses, and extreme sensitivity to light. They moved with a silent grace, navigating tight passages that would have confounded most adults. It was as if the caves themselves had shaped their physiology over decades, enforcing evolutionary pressures in real time. Historical accounts suggest that the clan's integration with the Harper family intensified both their genetic and cultural isolation. Genealogical records, sometimes scrawled by hand on crude parchment, preserved in personal ledgers discovered during later investigations, reveal a rigid adherence to intermarriage. The clan considered outsiders not only a threat but a source of contamination, their intrusion an existential danger to the purity of the bloodline. This belief, part superstition, part distorted eugenics, underpinned the clan's unwillingness to interact with neighbors or missionaries, reinforcing a cycle of isolation that would magnify physical and psychological divergence. By 1912, local folklore had fully embraced the cave demons. Miners, loggers, and itinerant travelers spoke in hushed tones of pale, deformed figures glimpsed in foggy hollows or at the edge of caves, sometimes carrying crude tools or disappearing into dark passages before anyone could approach. Missionary journals, sheriff reports, and newspaper accounts capture a consistent pattern. Outsiders feared, yet were fascinated by, a family that had carved a life entirely apart from the surface world, shaped as much by the hidden environment as by the complex web of kinship tying generations together. The story of the Blackburn-Harper clan, then, is not merely one of physical anomaly. It is a tale of geography, genetics, and human psychology converging to create an isolated society whose evolution diverged drastically from the world above. It illustrates how environmental pressures, cultural values, and reproductive patterns can combine to produce outcomes both tragic and mesmerizing, a living laboratory hidden deep in Kentucky's Appalachian hollows, where the shadows of the caves left indelible marks on flesh, mind, and culture alike. Life within the Blackburn-Harper clan was defined by darkness, silence, and the constant rhythm of the cave. What outsiders described as grotesque mutations or deformities were, to the clan, adaptations honed over decades in isolation. The limestone labyrinths of Harlan County were not merely shelters, they were a complete ecosystem, shaping every facet of existence. Chambers with ceilings draped in stalactites became living quarters, while narrow passageways served as hidden corridors linking families across generations. Flickering tallow candles cast long, undulating shadows on the walls, exaggerating the angles of twisted limbs and gaunt features, creating an illusion of creatures caught between human and something otherworldly. Food was a daily challenge. The clan cultivated small plots in pockets of arable land near cave entrances, growing corn, potatoes, and hardy vegetables that survived the thin mountain soil. But the caves themselves offered unique resources. Pale, nearly blind chickens roamed the dim chambers, raised specifically to endure the subterranean environment. Bats, abundant in every dark corridor, were a crucial source of protein, hunted with rudimentary tools fashioned from wood and stone. Fungi grew along damp walls and ceilings, carefully cultivated in niches shielded from drafts, forming an underground pantry that few outsiders could imagine. Thomas Wilson, an agricultural agent who visited briefly in 1908, noted the meticulous care with which these cave-adapted crops and animals were managed, an ingenuity born of necessity. The clan's physical adaptations were inseparable from this subterranean existence. Hands described historically as claw-like were often the result of syndactyly or extra digits, conditions exacerbated by inbreeding but functionally suited to navigating tight, jagged passages. Spinal deformities allowed the younger generation to crouch and crawl through tunnels with unusual agility. Eyes, adapted to minimal light, were highly sensitive, enabling detection of subtle movements in near darkness. Dr. Howard Garrison later recognized these traits as consistent with troglomorphic adaptations, commonly seen in cave-dwelling species worldwide. Behaviorally, the clan had evolved unique strategies for survival. Children learned to move silently, communicate through gestures or barely audible whispers, and sense vibrations in the earth to anticipate structural shifts or the approach of outsiders. The daily routines of the family were punctuated by these survival techniques, woven seamlessly into a rhythm of life that outsiders would interpret as eerie or unnatural. Yet, to those born into the caverns, these were ordinary practices, as natural as breathing. The caves also became a canvas for culture and belief. Rituals developed in the largest chambers, where the most physically distinct family members were treated as prophets or seers. Stalactite and stalagmite formations were read for divine patterns, mineral veins were interpreted as messages from the earth itself. These practices were reinforced by visible difference, the clan's own bodies serving as symbols of divine selection, proof of adaptation, and markers of spiritual authority. This blending of religion, isolation, and physical evolution created a self-perpetuating cycle, where the extreme traits resulting from inbreeding were viewed not as illness, but as evidence of sanctity and resilience. Outsiders were rarely tolerated. Encounters with neighbors or missionaries were brief, tense, and often terrifying for both parties. Individuals who emerged from caves for trade were described as moving with uncanny awareness, their eyes glinting unnaturally in the dim light, hands deftly gripping goods while instinctively avoiding contact with strangers. Folklore researchers like Dr. Elizabeth Coulson later noted that local vernacular referred to the family as cave demons not merely because of appearance, but due to the eerie, almost preternatural way they navigated the world, an interplay of physical anomaly and environmental adaptation that inspired both fear and fascination. Genetically, these adaptations were compounded by cultural practices. Intermarriage between close relatives was a deliberate choice, aimed at preserving what the clan believed to be a pure lineage. Handwritten genealogies found in later cave excavations demonstrate a meticulous record of unions and descendants, with annotations reflecting a belief system that framed inbreeding as a method of purification. This ideology, though horrifying to outsiders, was internally consistent. Physical anomalies and cognitive differences were interpreted not as deficits, but as evidence of spiritual or evolutionary advancement. By the early 1910s, the clan's isolation was nearly absolute. Streams in the cave system provided water, small cultivated plots supplemented their diet, and their ingenuity in managing cave-dwelling resources allowed for long-term survival. Children learned to interpret the echoing chambers as maps, adults taught them the subtle art of reading light, shadow, and sound, and elders transmitted both practical and spiritual knowledge. The outside world, with its threats and corruption, existed only as a distant, abstract concept. Yet even in this subterranean sanctuary, the pressures of life were undeniable. Harsh winters, limited food supplies, and the dangers of cave collapse posed constant threats. The family's reliance on inherited traits, both physical and behavioral, meant that survival was not guaranteed. Every generation was tested by the twin forces of environment and heredity, with the most extreme members often remaining in the deepest, most perilous caverns. In this hidden world, the Blackburn-Harper clan became something between myth and reality, a community shaped as much by geological and environmental factors as by human choice and genetic fate. Their existence challenged conventional understanding of human adaptation, blurring the line between the natural and the supernatural. To the casual observer, they were monsters; to themselves, they were heirs to an evolutionary experiment, masters of a world of shadow and stone, and witnesses to the intimate and terrifying interplay between culture, environment, and biology. Isolation had transformed the Blackburn-Harper clan into more than a secluded family. It had created a society with its own moral framework, spiritual hierarchy, and worldview. Over decades, the physical consequences of inbreeding were reframed internally as signs of divine selection. To outsiders, their unusual appearance and behavior evoked fear or pity. Within the caves, it became evidence of spiritual evolution. Elders taught that those with the most pronounced differences, the fused fingers, elongated limbs, or pale, almost translucent skin, were touched by forces beyond the surface world, and were destined to guide the clan through generations of darkness. Religious texts found in the caves, heavily annotated with cryptic commentary, show a fixation on separation and purity. Biblical passages about chosen peoples, isolation, and divine testing were circled and underlined repeatedly. Scholars later interpreted these annotations as part of a quasi-theocratic ideology that sanctified both the family's isolation and its patterns of intermarriage. Ezekiel Blackburn's youngest son, Isaiah, who exhibited the most extreme physical differences, became a central figure in this belief system. Reports suggest that rituals were conducted in the largest chambers of the cave network, where Isaiah's presence was regarded as essential to interpreting the world beyond the surface. Teacher Abigail Foster's 1911 encounters with the clan provide rare insight into how this worldview shaped daily life. Foster, trained in progressive educational methods, spent weeks gaining the trust of Sarah Harper, a young girl at the edge of Coal Creek. Through her, Foster recorded descriptions of rituals in which the most distinct members were treated as prophets. Stalactites were interpreted as divine signs, patterns in mineral deposits became a form of sacred communication. The physical differences of each clan member were seen not as weaknesses, but as manifestations of adaptation, an evolutionary and spiritual advantage allowing survival in the subterranean realm. The clan's perception of outsiders was equally rigid. The surface world was thought to be corrupt, decaying under the weight of weakness and moral decay. Anyone approaching the caves was considered a potential contaminant, a threat to the purity of the bloodline. Foster described Sarah's confusion when told of modern medicine, repeatedly questioning why anyone would deliberately weaken the bloodline by introducing external influence. These beliefs created a self-reinforcing cycle. Physical adaptations reinforced spiritual ideologies, which in turn justified continued inbreeding and withdrawal from the world above. By 1912, this insular worldview collided with the expanding industrial landscape. An unusually dry summer depleted the clan's traditional water sources, forcing members to venture further from the caves. Increased contact with mining operations and local settlements introduced a dangerous variable: fear and confrontation. Miners reported encounters with figures so strange, pale, and distorted that workers fled, convinced they were seeing inhuman creatures. These incidents quickly escalated tensions with surrounding communities, creating a climate of suspicion, panic, and folklore that would immortalize the term cave demons. State intervention followed, but not before the clan's ideology had fully crystallized. Each generation had internalized its own system of moral and spiritual authority. Elders guided younger members not only in practical survival skills, hunting bats, cultivating fungi, navigating dark passages, but in interpreting natural patterns as signs of divine will. Physical anomalies, rather than being regarded as defects, were celebrated as markers of status, prophecy, or evolutionary advantage. This inversion of values, disabilities reframed as spiritual gifts, reveals the powerful interplay of biology, culture, and environment in isolated communities. Documents recovered during later investigations underscore the extent of this worldview. Genealogical ledgers meticulously recorded intermarriages, with annotations expressing reverence for the resulting traits. The clan's isolation, its adaptation to cave life, and its rejection of surface norms became a self-perpetuating ecosystem. Genetic traits reinforced cultural beliefs, which in turn dictated behavior, perpetuating both physical and ideological divergence from the outside world. This complex belief system was not merely superstition, it shaped social hierarchy and governance. Authority rested with those who had survived and thrived in the deepest, darkest caverns, their physical adaptations marking them as spiritually and evolutionarily superior. Decision-making, including whom to marry and when to venture outside, was guided by interpretations of sacred texts, environmental cues, and observation of inherited traits. Outsiders were largely excluded, treated as polluting forces that threatened both bloodline integrity and spiritual sanctity. From a contemporary perspective, the Blackburn-Harper clan represents an extraordinary case study in how isolation can warp human culture and biology. Their story illustrates the rapid development of an alternative moral universe, where survival, reproduction, and spiritual interpretation intertwined with environmental adaptation. What began as practical seclusion had grown into a complete cultural and physiological divergence, an ecosystem shaped by caves, genetics, and ideology. Yet, despite the profound insularity, external pressures could not be avoided forever. Industrial expansion, environmental changes, and increasing encounters with surface society would eventually challenge the clan's worldview and force the first confrontation with authorities. By late 1912, the careful balance of their subterranean existence was destabilized, and the legacy of decades of isolation and inbreeding would be tested in ways that few could have foreseen. The fragile equilibrium of the Blackburn-Harper clan subterranean world was shattered in October 1912. A prolonged dry spell had diminished their traditional water sources, forcing family members into closer contact with miners and settlements beyond their caves. Reports of deformed figures emerging from the hollow sparked fear, fascination, and ultimately state intervention. The unusual appearance of the clan, pale skin, claw-like hands, unsteady gaits, and eyes adapted to darkness, led locals to believe they had encountered something other than human. Newspapers sensationalized the events, but court and sheriff records confirm confrontations that brought authorities directly into the clan's hidden world. Governor James McCreary authorized a joint operation between state police and public health officials, led by Dr. Arthur Childress of the Kentucky State Board of Health. The expedition, unprecedented in scope, ventured 5 miles into the cave systems. What they found was both astonishing and heartbreaking: crude dwellings illuminated by flickering tallow lamps, small cultivated plots within cave mouths, and families living in utter darkness for decades. Many clan members fled deeper into the labyrinth upon the approach of outsiders, while those who remained expressed terror at even the minimal exposure to light and the surface world. Medical examinations documented the consequences of generations of inbreeding with chilling clarity. Of the 42 individuals evaluated, 27 exhibited significant physical anomalies consistent with recessive genetic disorders, including cranial deformities, polydactyly, and spinal malformations. 14 were classified as having severe intellectual impairments, and 9 of the youngest children presented multiple congenital conditions, ranging from heart defects to neurological abnormalities. These findings provided one of the earliest comprehensive case studies of genetic isolation and consanguinity in the United States, illustrating the compounding effect of repeated close relative marriages over generations. Perhaps most haunting were the psychological effects. Older clan members recoiled from light, shielding their eyes and whispering warnings that the outside air would poison them. Survivor testimonies captured later by the Federal Writers Project reveal a profound sense of dislocation. Malcolm Harper, one of the few clan members to adapt to life outside the caves, recalled the sensory onslaught. "The light was like knives in my eyes for months, and the noise never stopped. But the worst was knowing we'd been separated forever from the deep places where our ancestors spoke to us through the stone." Such accounts highlight the trauma inflicted by forced removal from an environment that, though extreme, was both home and sanctuary for the clan. Despite the intervention, some members evaded authorities, retreating further into unexplored cave systems. Over subsequent decades, geological surveys occasionally recorded signs of habitation in hidden chambers, though no direct contact was documented. The clan story faded from public memory, preserved primarily in local folklore, missionary journals, and later historical research. It was not until the 1970s that academic interest revived, with geneticist Dr. Robert Ellison rediscovering Childress's reports while studying recessive disorders in Appalachian communities. Modern analysis confirmed at least 16 distinct inherited conditions within the clan, ranging from brittle bone disease to metabolic and neurological disorders. The legacy of the Blackburn-Harper clan extends beyond genetics. Their existence demonstrates how environmental pressures, cultural beliefs, and social isolation can combine to create a distinct human microcosm. Students of medical genetics now study this history not as a curiosity, but as a cautionary case illustrating how quickly genetic diversity can collapse and how cultural factors can reinforce biological consequences. Ethical questions also linger. The balance between cultural autonomy and public health intervention remains a topic of debate among modern scholars, emphasizing the complexity of judging historical actions by contemporary standards. Though the caves themselves are now part of protected areas within the Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, their silent passages retain echoes of a vanished community. What began as a family seeking refuge from a turbulent post-Civil War world became a profound illustration of human fragility, adaptation, and the consequences of prolonged isolation. The Blackburn-Harper clan may have disappeared from the Appalachian hollows, but their story continues to inform science, ethics, and folklore, a haunting reminder of how human societies can diverge when cut off from the broader currents of knowledge, genetics, and society.